who have renewed your memberships and made donations to the museum. We appreciate everything you've been doing to keep us afloat into 2021. This presentation of Storytelling Live is being recorded for future viewing on our membership website, Priority Boarding. We will have a brief Q&A session immediately following the presentation. If you do have questions for Alan, you may send us an email at membership@museumofflight.org, or if you select the Watch on YouTube button on the bottom of your video screen, if you have a Google account, you could just send us a question via the comment section. And with that, I'll hand things over to Alan.
Well, thank you, Carly, and welcome guests. I mentioned that normally we would have 18 of these tip-to-tail presentations under the Blackbird, but 2020 is different, and so I'm the only one making this presentation, for which I'm very honored. I wanted to point out that I'm a docent, but I'm also a retired mechanical engineer. It'll come up later in the session as to why. So here we have the Blackbird. This is obviously a picture taken from the balcony looking at the Blackbird, the MD-21. And I call it the superlative airplane. When they were passing out accolades for aircrafts, the Blackbird was the first in line. It's the fastest jet-powered piloted aircraft ever produced. It holds the altitude record, and it has many firsts in the design area, which I will hope to point out during this presentation. So let's start at the beginning. Why did we have the Blackbird? Well, in the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in what's called the Cold War. The Iron Curtain prevented information from flowing from the Soviet Union outward. So we didn't know exactly what was happening inside the Soviet Union, particularly regarding military activities. Well, this is where Clarence Kelly Johnson gets involved. He was the aerodynamicist at Lockheed, eventually forming a group called the Skunk Works. They produced, among other things, the plane you see here, which is the U-2. This was produced in 1955, and it did overfly the Soviet Union at about 70,000 feet, but in less than supersonic speeds. It was subsonic, but it took excellent pictures and got excellent intelligence. So it was all great and fine until May 1st, 1961, when Francis Gary Powers was filing a U-2 over the middle of the Soviet Union and caused him to crash. Well, this was a great embarrassment to the United States because we had to sign a treaty that said we would not have manned overflights of Russia. Well, the government and Kelly Johnson realized we needed a faster and higher flying airplane. So the CIA got involved with something called Project Oxcart, and they developed the first Blackbird, which was the A-12. So here is a video I'm going to show you, which will give you a lot of background on the Blackbird, and which I'll elaborate in later.
The SR-71 Blackbird was a high-speed, high-altitude spy plane that flew in the 1960s. It's one of the coolest planes ever made, and you've probably already heard of it, even if you don't think so. It's made cameos in movies, comic books, and games. It was for transport used in the X-Wing. The character Jetfire in Transformers. Will Smith hit golf balls off its wing in I Am Legend. It inspired the J-type starship in Star Wars. There was an unlockable killstreak reward in the Call of Duty games. So why do people like this plane so much? Well, it's powerful. The J-58 jet engine is capable of 34,000 pounds of thrust. It has 2 of those. That means it's about as powerful as an ocean liner. These engines also seem to be magic. In one mission, the pilot discovered that flying faster than Mach 3.2 actually reduces fuel consumption. I'll provide a video in the description that explains how that's possible. JP7 jet fuel was developed especially for the Blackbird, and it was so effective that it's still used in the most powerful aircraft today. 2. It's fast. Flying from New York to London takes around 6 hours and 15 minutes in the Boeing 747. The famous Concorde managed it in 2 hours and 52 minutes. The Blackbird, 1 hour 55. And in July 1976, it set a world record, fastest manned jet-powered aircraft, reaching 2,193 miles per hour, a record which still stands today. It was never shot down. That's despite a total of more than 4,000 missiles fired at it. So how did it manage to deal so effectively with those threats? Well, the standard of evasive action was to simply accelerate and outrun any incoming missile. 4. It wasn't that far off being an actual spaceship. Not just because it was tested in Area 51. It flew at altitudes of over 85,000 feet, which is another record for sustained flight, by the way. Pilot Mick McCrary said, "It's astonishing. You're above the haze and in the atmosphere. How deep into space you can see from up there. There's all this meteor activity you never see on the ground. A lot of stuff's going on." Richard Graham said, "The view is spectacular, being able to see the curvature of the Earth and black space above filled with stars." And finally, it wasn't just used for stealth. Because it could travel fast enough to break the sound barrier, the plane was a sonic boom machine. Here's former pilot Colonel Buzz Carpenter.
The greatest sonic boom that was ever set up, it was May 1972. 3 SR-71s took off from Okinawa, Japan, and simultaneously overflew Hanoi at the same time. I've talked to the POW. They said it scared the living daylights out of the guards because they'd never heard a shock like that. It didn't sound like a bomb, and actually fled. We called the shock wave that came across the ground the sound of freedom. Can you imagine that sometimes we were tasked to overfly foreign ceremonies, to boom heads of state when they were greeting each other, to remind them that they were doing things that were counter to U.S. policy?
Okay, I'm back live. I hope that give you a number of sites about the Blackbird and operation and the like. So, in terms of history, the first A-12, we'll explain the differences between A-12 and SR-71 later, was in April 1962. Well, they didn't even get the contract, or they started to design it until 1958. And they got the contract in 1960. So they designed the A-12 from concept to flying in 22 months. So the first SR-71, which is a two-man cockpit, flew in December 1969. And they continued to have military operation until 1990. There was also some SR-71 flights in the 90s, but they were for NASA and other research operations. There were 50 of these planes built in 4 different versions. All told, there was 158 pilots and RSO, that's Reconnaissance Systems Officer, pairs. Now, where do we get the name SR-71? Well, in 1965, President Johnson basically announced the Blackbird program. In the script that he read from, it said SR-71, whereas the development was RS-71. But who's going to contradict the boss? So it became the SR-71. So here's some basic facts. It has several nicknames. The Lady in Black, the Sled, because if you look at it from the top, it looks a little bit like a sled, and Habu. Well, Habu is a snake found on Okinawa, one of the operational bases. It's very quick and very deadly. And so the Blackbird crews adopted Habu as their nickname and even used it in a lot of their logos. You can see the differences between the A-12 and SR-71 here. SR-71 is a little bit larger, has more fuel, but actually is not quite as fast as the A-12. So basic facts, it cruised at Mach 3.2. That's in aeronautical terms, 3.2 times the speed of sound, excuse me, which is right around 2,000 miles an hour. And it cruised at 80,000 feet plus 85,000 feet. Now, this is very interesting considering the whole design project was done with slide rules and drafting tables. There were no design computers. And for those who don't know what a slide rule is, it's a computational device. It's a stick with a slide in the middle, and basically you can multiply and divide and do logarithms and all this kind of stuff. but for the life of me, slide rules never added or subtracted, and drafting tables. So again, there was no CATIA, no AutoCAD. It was manual. So what's the performance? Well, 3.2 again is about 2,000 miles an hour. This is actually faster than a speeding bullet. Now imagine, if you will, hypothetically, if a 30-06 was fired from New York towards Los Angeles at the same time an SR-71 passed by, and if somehow this speeding bullet could maintain altitude and speed, the SR-71 would beat it to Los Angeles by 7 minutes. Or another way, there was one story about an SR-71 flying over Arizona, and the RSO was monitoring communications, one of them being the ATAC, or Aviation Control, out of Los Angeles, when he heard a request from an Cessna 72, in which was, "Can you give us our ground speed?" Well, okay, this is a normal broadcast, and the operator came back and said, "We have you at 90 miles an hour. Shortly thereafter, a Beechman 18, like we have in the museum there, came in with the same request, and the response was, "We have you at 120 miles an hour." Well, then the SRO was very surprised when a Navy F-18 asked for the same thing. It says, "This is an F-18 doing whatever they were, and what is our ground speed?" Well, the answer came back at 690 miles an hour. Well, the RSO said, "This is kind of strange, because they got great instrumentation. They know exactly how fast they're going." So he broke protocol, got in, said, "This is Aspen 2. We're at 85,000 feet. We're requesting a ground speed check." The answer came back, "Well, we have you at 1,900 miles an hour." The RO says, "Well, we show 1,950 miles an hour." Well, the ATAC operator says, "Well, perhaps your instrumentation is better than ours. Have a good day, sir." So, and again, 80,000 feet. Let's put that up. That's 15 miles up. And as the video showed, you can see the curvature of the Earth with a black sky above. It's not blue, it's black. You can see stars, even nominally during the daytime. So, here are the different versions. The A-12 was a single-seater operated by the CAA. The YF-12 was a variant of that. It was an interceptor. You can see that it had missiles underneath. There's a missile being shown being loaded. It didn't work out, but it was a try. Then we had the MD-21. Well, there were 2 of those produced. We have the Survivor. There was an accident in 1966 where the sister ships of this had an accident while flying at 80,000 feet, broke up, and unfortunately there was a fatality involved. So the program was discontinued. Then there is the SR-71. It's a 2-seater operated by the Air Force. There's one other variant, and that's the A-12B, and it is a trainer, and it has 2 operational cockpits in it. It also has an underpowered engine, the original engine, a GT-58, not 58, 85, I think, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, it didn't go much more over the speed of sound as opposed to Mach 3.2. So here are the different profiles. It's not the best slide in the world, but you can see the trainer down there in the bottom with the 2 cockpits. So here's the MD-21. This is a picture taken in our museum. You can see the drone on top of the Blackbird, and only 2 were built. It was meant to bypass this treaty that the United States signed with the Soviet Union, because the treaty said manned overflight. It didn't say unmanned. So the drone here was programmed to fly autonomously over the restricted airspace, the Soviet Union. It could go up to 100,000 feet, had a 1,250-mile range. Then it was programmed to come back at a lower altitude, come over unrestricted airspace like the ocean, drop its data on a parachute for recovery, and then it would self-destruct. Well, as I mentioned, there was this accident in 1966. The sister ship of this, on the 4th trial to eject the drone, instead of going on a downward curve, it was flying horizontal. So the drone lifted off, got up so high, and it hit the shock wave from the nose off the mothership and unstarted. It lost its propulsion. Came back and hit the port side tail, the one you're looking at there in the back side of the drone. It took out part of the vertical stabilizer, part of the nacelle, but most importantly, pitched the mothership from horizontal to vertical. And this was not designed, and it broke up. So now the pilot and the launch control officer, LCO, fell from 77,000 feet to 55,000 feet. And I know this because I was given an eyewitness account by a tanker, an KC-135Q, that was in that mission. At 55,000 feet, they ejected in their spacesuits, which we'll do later. And unfortunately, the launch control officer broke his arm when he ejected. They both dropped into the Pacific off of Vandenberg Air Force Base. The pilot was able to get in his raft, and he was ultimately rescued. But the launch control officer with one arm could not get into his raft. He was running out of air in his spacesuit, so he opened the visor to get air. Water got in his suit, and he drowned. He was not a CIA officer. He was a Lockheed employee. And so Kelly Johnson, who was a personal friend of him, Ray Torovic, Kelly Johnson canceled the program, put our plane in storage in Comdale until 1994 when we got it to the museum. So here's another picture of a drone. This actually is a drone off of a B-52, a variant of the original one. So after the Blackbird program was canceled, the Air Force picked it up with B-52s, and they made 4 successful launches with this drone from a B-52. That ultimately was canceled also because the satellites started getting into better shape. So here's a cockpit. The 2 cockpits you see here, the pilot's cockpit with a future pilot there. Again, this is a picture from our museum. And the RSO's cockpit in the back, right here. So the design parameters for this craft is all about speed and heat. Going at this speed of Mach 3.2, there's a lot of skin friction on this bird, and it heats up. I'll show you a diagram later of how fast, or how hot. So Lockheed had to invent technology just to get this plane off the ground. 90% of the plane is made of titanium, because titanium is the only metal that holds its strength at those temperatures. But in the 1960s, roughly, they didn't know how to work titanium. It never been done. How to make sheets out of it, how to bend it, how to rivet it, how to form it. They had to invent all that stuff. And it's being used today in manufacturing. There were several unique systems aboard the bird. Obviously cooling. Well, they had to cool the cockpit. They had to cool the avionics and a couple other instruments. They did that with fuel, actually. And fuel is the heat medium. The hydraulics were made specifically, the hydraulic fluid, for high temperatures. The wiring was made for high temperature, the insulation, and the environmental aspects of flying in this machine. Now here's this temperature map, and I don't expect you to know all of it, but down here, you see 1,050 degrees. That's pretty hot. Look up here at the cockpit, that's 622 degrees. That's 122 degrees hotter than a self-cleaning oven. Yet they had a man inside, actually 2 men. So its construction. Well, it's an early stealth vehicle. And one of the reasons for that is the shape. It took many, many hours to figure out what the shape was, but there was a shock wave here that went down this way and missed the wing. So the entire airplane was on the backside of the shock wave. That was pretty significant. The vertical stabilizers here are canted in at 15 degrees. No radar return. The large wings you see here created a ground effect when it's very low. This gave additional lift at lower speeds. The Blackbird is called a Blackbird because it's black. Well, it's black because it has a ferric oxide coating on it, which is useful for 2 purposes. Being black, it emitted heat better than any other color. That's called emissivity. But it also absorbed radar signals from the ground and therefore became early stealth. See in the background here, there's a Piper Cub in our museum. At altitude, the radar signature of an SR-71, which is over 100 feet long, had the same signature as that Piper Cub. Of course, what Piper Cub's going to be doing, Mach 3, 85,000 feet, but that's another story. There were many shock waves. Actually, the shock wave in here has a component. There's a large positive spike, comes down, then there's a low negative and a second spike. So this is why you get that characteristic boom boom that was mentioned in the video. It has a large fuel capacity. You saw it had 180,000 pounds in the SR-71, but it got used up in a hurry. Every one of the Blackbirds was handmade. There was no production line. It was handmade down there in the Skunk Works in Burbank, California. There were a few computers aboard. You got to remember, this is 1960 technology. We didn't have the main integrated circuits we've got today, but there were 4. One was a stability augmentation system. Well, pilot couldn't fly this thing with all the little permutations that go along, but the computer could, and it was extremely reliable. So this allowed the pilot a smooth platform in which to fly. They had the astral inertial navigation system. What this means is when they took a picture, they wanted to know exactly where they were and how to get back to base. Well, they had an inertial navigation system, which is pretty good, but they calibrated this against a star setting, hence the astral part. So even at daytime, they could see the stars above, and they found at least 2 of 16 that tell them exactly where they were. They had an air data computer. Because of the extreme speed, the data they picked up from the pitot tube and other instruments had to go through the computer to be read out. And finally, there's a compressor inlet pressure, CIP control, that I'll explain later in a diagram. So we have the JT58D. Yeah, these are both pictures taken in our museum. You can see the JT58D here, which is a military turbine from about here forward or from here aft. Behind this is a afterburner, which you can see on the tail end. It's the only continuously operating afterburner in existence. Now, there are afterburners on the F-18s and a lot of other planes, but they can't last forever. They can't operate continuously. The JT58D did, and that's the secret of the propulsion system on this Blackbird. So here we have the sail up front. You see the spike, and you see some vents here. All this was to control the pressure into the compressor. Here's a couple more versions of louvers in and out and the spike. So here's the thermodynamics behind that. At speed, at Mach 3.2, for instance, you have the original center body shock wave, which misses the limit, the inlet lip. Then you have a whole bunch of these reflected shocks. Well, every time the airspeed went across one of these shocks, it reduced its speed and increases pressure until you finally get to the terminal shock here. So this area here is subsonic. There's the compressor face. Well, this has one additional benefit in that all that pressure increase acts like a it's thrust. So it goes all the way through the engine, out the back end, and becomes like a ramjet. In addition to the other aspects of the turbine and the afterburner. So that's how the propulsion is done. When you look at the landing gear on our version, and you see Amelia Earhart in the background, it's one of our exhibits way back when, the nose wheel is black, it's normal aviation rubber, but the main gear is gray. Well, the wheel well for the nose gear is cooled by the avionic cooling exhaust, so it's at a reasonable temperature, but the main landing gear is way back further, and its wheel well is very hot. So to counteract that, they imposed aluminum into the rubber, hence this. Both tires had about 400 psi pressure in them, so filling up the tires was quite a safety procedure. How do you start this? Well, it was mentioned that they had a special fuel. It's called JP7, because JP4 that you normally find in airlines would explode at these temperatures. So they developed JP7, which has a very high flash point, about 750 degrees, and a very low vapor pressure. But how do you start this? You can't use a spark plug, can't even use an accelerating torch. You take JP7, put a less a bucket full of ground, throw in a acetylene torch, it'll put out the torch. So they use a special chemical called TEB, triethylene borane. Excuse me. It was held in a tank here on top of the engine. Had enough TEB in there for 18 starts. Initial starts plus any restarts they had to do while they're in the air. In order to turn the engine over, you have the start cart. This is one we have on the floor. And those are two Buick racing engines. And then all total of 600 horsepower. And they had a shaft, a squib, which would go up in the engine, turn it over. They get the airflow through the engine. They obviously could inject the fuel into the combustion chamber. They put a squirt of TEB in, there'd be an explosion and a green flash out the back end, and the engine would operate. They do the same thing with the afterburner. So, the SR-71 is about reconnaissance. It was unarmed. It was not a fighting vehicle, it was a reconnaissance vehicle. So, they had two basic systems. One was cameras, and here you see the ports for the camera up in the nose of the SR-71. They also had radar. This is a side-looking radar, one of several aboard the SR-71. The SR-71, when 85,000 feet, had a path of 50 miles wide, so 25 miles off the center line of the vehicle on the radar. They could survey 100,000 square miles on any given mission. That's a lot of things. And likewise with the cameras. So I mentioned the special fuel, JP7, and I mentioned briefly earlier about cooling with the fuel. Well, here you had 100,000 pounds of fuel, and they would run this through a heat exchanger, run the air through the heat exchanger to cool it into the cockpit, into the avionics component, into the astral inertial guidance system, all to cool them down. When the fuel was depleted, taken away from the tank, they over-blanketed it with nitrogen. Well, this was for fire safety purposes. Again, environmental controls, I mentioned that, the cooling in the cockpit. It'll be mentioned, I think it's later, but I'll point it out now. The temperature in the cockpit was 68 degrees, and the effective altitude was 28,000 feet. So it was not 85,000 feet and whatever temperature. Again, I mentioned the avionics in here, the augmentation stability control, the astral inertial guidance system, the compressor inlet pressure. There were some pretty unusual features. And this, as an engineer, I appreciate what they had to do. And I call this the epitome of engineering design. They had so many problems that they had to solve that they never thought of before, and they got it done. Metallic O-rings. Well, obviously rubber O-rings would not work. Purging with nitrogen in the hydraulic lines to take out and get rid of any oxygen. The oil that's used in the engine is so highly viscous, it's nearly solid below 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, at higher temperatures, it flowed like a normal liquid. Again, the cockpit was regulated to 68 degrees and 28 feet effective elevation. And the electrical connections were plated with gold. This is to make certain that they were not corroded and they would effectively work at high temperatures. The pilot and the RSO both wore these suits adopted from the Mercury space program. Well, the reason for this, if they had to eject at 85,000 feet, they would die instantly because of the low pressure. And this also gave them a certain amount of physical protection, because all of a sudden they had 0.4 psi ambient air out there, and they had 4.5 psi inside the spacesuit. Obviously, it'd blow up and look like the Michelin Doughboy. The crew, the single-man by A-12 and the two-man by the U.S. Air Force, this group was highly cohesive, both crew and supports, that support staff, the mechanics and avionic techs, etc. They stayed together. They worked as a unit. They didn't move in and out like normal Air Force crews. They were assigned to the Blackbird program, and they stayed with the Blackbird program. So what does it take to be a pilot? Well, you can see here, there's a number of characteristics. As it turns out, the average was 33 years old. They had over 2,500 man-hours of flight. They were ranked major or above, and they held a secret clearance. So let's look at some operations here, again via video.
Pratt & Whitney J-58 engines, big enough to power the Queen Mary, launch its 140,000-pound body to the edge of space. The bullet from a high-powered rifle leaves the barrel at about 3,000 feet per second. On a routine mission, the Blackbird travels faster, 3,200 feet per second, for up to 90 minutes at a time. No matter how serene it may look, this kind of speed requires unyielding precision.
You know, Mach 3, boom, the turn radius is something like 100 miles, and they have all these critical fuel problems and other stuff. And so it's not a very spontaneous experience. These are carefully planned, choreographed missions.
With the thunderous clap of a sonic boom, the Blackbird hurtles through the frigid atmosphere, leaving a fiery tail of shock diamonds in its wake. At 2,200 miles per hour, the aircraft becomes superheated from the friction created as the air rushes by.
When you go Mach 3, the amount of heat that the whole airframe, everything experiences, all this heat, and nothing that they have at the store works. You know, there's no paint, no rubber, nothing. You know, metals, plastics, all this stuff is useless. And they just had to go through so many contortions to make every single part of the plane tolerant of these extreme temperatures.
Temperature affects everything on this airplane. The average person probably is not cognizant of that fact, but the faster you go, the harder things get.
The Lockheed jet is 9/10 titanium, and when they build it, the CIA uses a phantom company to buy the material from the world's largest supplier, the Soviet Union. In flight, the titanium skin reaches 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, causing it to expand by more than half a foot. This heat-induced expansion posed a real challenge to the Skunk Works team.
When in design they found that the aircraft was heated and then cooled, then the titanium skin would buckle and not return to shape. They found by longitudinally corrugating the wing and fuselage parts of the aircraft, then the aircraft would go through the heating cycle, cool back down, and return to shape.
One of the puzzles of extreme heat was never really solved.
Sealants for the fuel tanks. They never came up with a polymer that would seal the joints in the skin panels that hold the fuel in, so the Blackbirds sit on the ground and weep. That seems silly. You can look, oh, these stupid guys back in the 60s didn't know what they were doing. There's still no plastic, you know, that can get to 700F and not turn into burnt hot dog oxide.
Once at altitude, the heated skin stretches, sealing the aircraft's fuel zones. In its 30 years of service, only 150 aviators have qualified to fly the SR. It is an elite fraternity. Prior to every Blackbird mission, 36 hours are devoted to prepare men and machine for flight. One of the most valued traits is maturity. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Flynn is 43. All who enter the program must meet one fundamental requirement. They must be married.
Thank you, sir.
Most importantly, they must be physically fit. At altitude, Even a simple toothache can lead to blackouts.
12115. Answer.
The two-man crew is essential to success. Soon, pilot and reconnaissance systems officer, or RSO, will be traveling faster than a speeding bullet while operating some of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus ever built. They are, in effect, the Blackbird's central nervous system. 2 brains, 2 pairs of eyes, 2 sets of hands. Without them, this mass of metal and electronics could not function.
Something that's different about flying the SR-71 is the absolute and total man-machine integration. People talk about strapping an airplane on, but I don't believe you strapped an airplane on until you snapped your spurs into the ejection seat and you hooked up your life support hoses and you've been given that responsibility.
Before flight, each of the SR's huge power plants requires a jump start from 2 454 cubic inch Chevy engines. The wine is deafening, and the steaming tarmac reeks of JP7 seeping from the plane's unsealed fuel tanks. So much fuel is lost prior to launch that the Blackbird takes off with nearly dry tanks. The SR must join with a waiting tanker just minutes into flight. Slowing this trisonic jet to match the tanker's subsonic speed is anything but easy.
It is a very difficult task for the pilots. That is one of the things that washed people out of the program more than any other part of the regime.
United 382 Salt Lake,
You always breathe a sigh of relief when you feel the boom kick you off and you know that you're full and you can go again.
15 minutes and 80,000 pounds of fuel later, the Blackbird is ready to retrieve images from halfway around the Earth.
Okay, well, they want to correct one fallacy that was in that video, and they said that they took off with nearly dry tanks because of the leaks. Well, that's not exactly true. They took off with minimal fuel in there to reduce the weight. It didn't take as much fuel to lift off a lighter aircraft, and then they would go up and, you see, meet the tanker to top off and then start the mission. As of 1980, here's some of the fast-track promotions that occurred within this program. You can read the number of colonels, brigadier generals, major generals, and even one lieutenant general. So obviously being in the SR-71 program was beneficial to an Air Force career. So we had operations. They had 3 main bases. They had Beale Air Force Base in California, just north of Sacramento. They had Kadena on the island of Okinawa, and they had Mendenhall in Great Britain. So these would be the main areas that they would operate from. So they would spend 6 weeks at Beale, go out to Kadena, spend 6 weeks there, come back to Beale, 6 weeks at Beale, go to Mendenhall. Of course, they had other bases, they could use, but these are the main bases for operations, etc. Well, as you can see, these planes required high maintenance, but the mechanics, the avionics techs, the planners, the psychological support division, PSD, that's the medical side. They were all trained, very competent, and they maintained their presence in the program. But these planes did require a lot of maintenance to operate well, because you could not make a mistake. If a mistake occurred, it occurred in a hurry. And occasionally they did. So it was mentioned that this was a choreographed program. So operational planning was absolute. From the first time that someone said, well, let's go look at some area, until they had the debrief following the mission, everything was planned. They've got planned who's going to be on the mission, who's the backup, who's the backup to backup, where are they going to go, where are they going to refuel, where are they going to turn, how fast are they going to turn, where is the hot zone, where are they going to they have their reconnaissance done. And all of this was pre-planned. Nothing was taken as a chance. So when a crew was assigned, they had a primary crew. They had a crew that was in their airplanes without starting, and they had another crew on base. So they had 3 levels of backup or operation, main and 2 backups. So at the pilots would go out to the PSD, the Psychological Support Division, and they would be suited up. They'd go through a medical exam. You saw part of that. So that makes certain that the pilot and the RSO were in top physical shape. They were given a meal of steak and eggs, high protein, low fiber. There's a story that says, well, Daddy must be flying tomorrow because he can't eat the broccoli tonight. So anyway, go from there. They go out and they go out to the plane in a van and easy chairs. They go up and get into their cockpits, and then the pilot and RSO would just simply put their arms on the sill. They didn't touch anything. The mechanics would do all the plug-ins with the hoses and cables and all this kind of stuff. They knew what they were doing. The pilots would sit there and be prepared. So finally, they were told they were ready to go. Then they would close the cockpit and take off. So it was quite an operation, very precise. So here are some aerial operations. Again, minute choreographics. And it was a worldwide area that they could work on, except for the restricted zone over the Soviet Union and a few other places like that. But even that, they could work around. They did this extended by refueling. Here you see a KC-135Q, which was assigned to the Blackbird program, dedicated. They had the JP-7 aboard. They could use JP-4, but they would have to stay subsonic. And a typical flight pattern, I mentioned this earlier, it was planned. They go from a base, be it Mendenhall or Kadena. They fly over the zone, they do what they had and come back, or they go to a different base. Sometimes they go to extended bases. There was one time when an SR-71 crew went into Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean to do a mission. And so they gather the data, they bring it back, and then the techs would look through it. The photography, the radar strips, the electronics, eavesdropping, this is all done back at base. There was, unfortunately, there was no real-time link in those days. So I mentioned the air refueling. Well, this is the one taken at our museum, our MD-21. You see the refueling port behind the reconnaissance systems operator's cockpit. Here's an extended fueling. So here's a short video without sound of a refueling. So just to back up a little bit, you see this picture here. The SR-71 would come up from down below, slow down to a speed that matched the tanker, and come up into position by strictly visual means. There was no communication until this boom extended, and they had a intercom. But then they get into the rough position, then the boom operator would fly this boom into position and hook up. So here are some records. Some say it got up to 100,000 feet. Well, that may be classified data. Some said it got up to a speed of Mach 3.5. Again, that could be more of a legend. But when the SR-71 went to Farnborough, England, they flew from New York to London in an hour and 56 minutes. Again, it was pointed out that 747 is a little over 6 hours. On their return, they went from London to San Francisco in 3 hours and 47 minutes. Of course, this includes some refueling. And finally, when the program was disbanded in 1990, the crew that took the SR-71 back to Udarts, Haiti, the Smithsonian at Dulles, they decided to make a speed run. So they got up to speed over the Pacific. They crossed the line at Los Angeles. Then 67 minutes and 20 seconds later, they crossed another line at over Washington, D.C. Almost 2,800 miles in a little over an hour. That became a speed record. So we have a number of stories around this thing. I say refueling over Norway. Well, one of the favorite areas for them to look at was the Murmansk Sea and Archangel up in Russia, looking for Soviet submarines. Well, in one of these missions, they came back and they had to refuel over Norway. No big deal. Norway was an ally in NATO. So they're refueling, as you saw, the two of them coupled up, and up come two F-16s from the Norwegian Air Force. Well, again, they're a partner, no big deal. So just as they're starting to break away, one of the F-16 pilots turns sideways and holds up his finger to the V signal. You want to drag? Well, the pilot looked at this and he said, he stepped back and returned. Yeah, let's drag. Well, two F-16, they were already flying. They ignited their afterburners and took off. Well, it took a little bit longer for the F-71 to get in place. They had lighted their afterburner and smoked the F-16s. Now, a typical mission in the 1980s, it was a bombing in Berlin that they had traced back to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. NATO bombed Libya, but they wanted to have a bombing assessment of what happened. So they sent in an SR-71 out of Mendenhall. So they flew east over the center of the Mediterranean, turned south at Benghazi on the eastern edge of Libya. They flew southwest to Tripoli, again turned in their 90-mile turning radius towards Sicily. Well, as they got near Tripoli, the RSO got warning that missiles were fired at them. So the pilot pushed the throttle forward, increased their speed, and, well, they missed. They got over Sicily. The RSO said, hey, we got to turn, slow down. The pilot retracted the speed. They turned to the west over Sicily and overshot their tanker at Gibraltar. Okay. During the 60s, they had SR-71s fly over Cuba, and they detected MiG-23s on the planes. Well, this got into a diplomatic row, and eventually Soviet Union withdrew their MiG-23s. Now, it depends on who you talk to. Anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 missiles were shot at, but none hit. Well, there was a little secret behind that. In the tail of the SR-71 was a transponder that showed the plane's position 5 miles behind where they actually were. So this is where the missiles were aimed at, and at that speed, the missiles couldn't maneuver fast enough to catch up with the plane. So no aircraft could challenge it, not even the MiG-25, which was designed to go after the B-70. And it had a Mach 2.5 speed, but they couldn't maintain it for very long, or they would ruin their engines. So no manned aircraft could ever challenge an SR-71, and never did. So what's the future? Well, the future may be here, the SR-72. This is a plan by Lockheed for a hypersonic reconnaissance plane, unmanned, where hypersonic is Mach 6 and above. So that would go all over the world. In fact, I think I've got a small video. I never thought about that.
In 1976, the SR-71 Blackbird became the fastest ever air-breathing manned aircraft, a record that it still holds to this day. At a top speed of 2,200 miles per hour, or 3,500 kilometers per hour, and flying at altitudes of over 80,000 feet, it was practically untouchable by the enemy. The aircraft was used to fly over enemy territory and collect intelligence and photograph enemy locations and positions. The SR-71 excelled at this task. During its operational life, enemies fired more than 800 surface-to-air missiles at the craft in an attempt to shoot it down, all of which missed. Its high speed and high altitude allowed the craft to simply outrun any threats. For all its strengths, there were several faults the SR-71 had that led to its retirement. It was extremely expensive to operate and maintain, and the rise of satellites created a faster and safer reconnaissance method. The U.S. Air Force finally retired the SR-71 permanently in 1998. Ever since its retirement, rumors have spread about a possible successor to the SR-71 being built. Enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists alike claim that the government was working on a top-secret, hypersonic aircraft named Aurora. Sightings have been claimed everywhere from England to Area 51. While most of these sightings have been dismissed, Lockheed Martin, the company that built the SR-71, now confirms that they are currently developing a successor to the Blackbird. The aircraft is stated to be similar in size to the SR-71, or about 100 feet long. Despite the new aircraft being dubbed the SR-72, this name is likely a placeholder and will not be the final name of the craft. The craft is stated to operate at twice the speed of the SR-71, putting its top speed at over 4,500 miles an hour, or 7,000 kilometers per hour. At these speeds, even modern surface-to-air missile defenses will have a hard time intercepting the aircraft, allowing the SR-72 to operate in a similar manner as the SR-71 40 years ago. Unlike the SR-71, the SR-72 was planned to be unmanned. The SR-71 actually had a lesser-known cousin that was unmanned, called the D-21. The D-21 drone could fly just as fast and just as high as the Blackbird, and was designed to carry out the same recon missions. The craft, however, performed poorly, repeatedly crashing over enemy territory or during recovery due to technical limitations of the time. With the rise of advanced avionics and guidance systems, drones have now become an integral part of the reconnaissance mission. The new aircraft will allow extremely fast intelligence gathering and aerial imagery of enemy targets. It is planned to be able to close the surveillance coverage gap that exists between satellites and the current slower UAVs. There has also been discussion about a possible smaller manned variant of the SR-72. Along with reconnaissance, the craft is also stated to carry out a strike role as well. In this role, it is in a way similar to the B-2 stealth bomber, using its speed rather than stealth to protect itself while flying over and destroying a target. Despite the recent sightings of subscale models at places like Plane 42, the aircraft will not be entering service anytime soon. Flight testing has still not yet started, and funding has reportedly also been an issue. If the project is fully funded, the SR-72 would still not be expected to enter operational service until at least the 2030s.
So we see a video here, and perhaps there's going to be some new superlative aircraft. But so far, the SR-71 holds the record and is the champ. This is for the saying that a lot of the crews had. They said they were alone, unarmed, and unafraid. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to my broadcast. I hope you've learned something and appreciate the engineering challenges and success of the SR-71 Blackbird.
All right. Thank you, Alan. So I do have a couple questions for you.
Okay.
First one I have is, how did they record and bring back radar data?
It was on a magnetic tape. They stored this on a tape, and they would download this when they returned to whichever base they were coming back to. That was one of the difficulties of the program in that day. Again, you got to remember, it was 30 years ago plus, and they didn't have a remote live downlink the system at that time. So it was on magnetic tape. And of course, the pictures were on film.
All right, let's see. Next question I have, what were the safety precautions on the ground for the leaking fuel tanks? And the same question on for ramps and in the hangar.
Well, you have to remember the flash point of JP7 was 750 degrees. The biggest hazard was slipping and falling. There wasn't a fire hazard. Of course, may have been an environmental hazard if there were any kind of fumes around, but again, with a very low vapor pressure, there weren't very many fumes. So the safety was pretty much, as far as the fuel is concerned, was the fuel itself. There were other safety concerns about the aircraft. There always is. It's a dangerous environment, but they were very well trained and very well executed.
All right. Next question I have is, do you know how the Blackbird at the museum was acquired?
It is still on loan, actually, from the U.S. Air Force. We don't own it. It's on a permanent loan. I don't know the story of how we have obtained it. All I know is that we got it in 1994, and it was shipped here in 7 pieces and had to be reassembled and then put into the well of the Great Gallery.
All right. All right, so that's all the questions I have so far. Alan, do you have any good book suggestions for anybody who would like to learn more about the Blackbird?
Well, actually, the one that I have by Brian Schul, you can get out of the gift shop, and I think it's called Driving the Sled or something of that nature, but it's by Brian Schul. Brian has actually been a visitor to the museum on several occasions, usually during Seafair, and it's probably one of the first books you can get. Some people say that he exaggerates things, but it surely gives you a feel for what he and his RSO accomplished, and a lot of the stories I told came from his book. So that would be a good starter.
Perfect. Wonderful. All right. So I don't have any other questions. Alan, was there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap things up for today?
Well, I've got my fingers crossed that I can show this in person in the not distant future. We appreciate all this remote broadcast, but there's nothing like seeing the guests, looking them in the eyes and answering their questions and seeing their smiles. So I'm glad I was able to make this presentation for the museum for the Tip to Tail program this year. And I feel honored again to have that ability. So stick with it. We will be back as soon as we can.
Wonderful. And actually, I actually have one question that snuck in when you were talking, and I agree with Alan. You know, we definitely miss the docents at the museum. Definitely speak on behalf of all of the staff for that one. But once we do reopen, if you folks have a chance to check out one of our virtual docent stations, it's definitely very neat, and you'll be able to interact live with one of our docents, and you can ask any questions you have about any airplane exhibits. It's really a great program, and Alan is a part of that as well.
And let me add on to that, Carly. There are currently 4 stations around the museum. They have set up a monitor and a microphone so that the guests can see me and talk to me. And so I affectionately call this a docent in a box. But it gives us a chance to be docents again remotely, and I don't have to get completely dressed up as a docent, and I don't have to travel.
There you go.
It requires the museum to be open, and hopefully we can.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Let's see. Okay, the question I have is, with all the development, with all the development technical challenges, were many found during development testing, or were most anticipated based on prior high altitude, high speed programs?
It's actually a combination of both. Now you have to remember that the initial design was started in 1958. The real hands-on design started in 1960. And some things were known, like the need for the reflective shock waves going into the engine and a few other things. But some they had to invent, like how to work the titanium, how to take care of the expansion and contraction without buckling the skin, and a few other things. So it was just, I frankly say it's an epitome of engineering, because what they did and when they did it and how they could do it. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Perfect. And oh, the questions keep coming for you, Alan.
Okay.
See, did they? Question I have is, did they defuel the planes if they put them in a hangar?
They would refuel. They put the fuel in just before the start of a mission because obviously they were going to leak some across the floor. They had an acceptable drip rate or leak rate, and if they exceeded this, obviously they had to do something about it. But they put the fuel in pretty much at the last minute to conserve as much as they can. And then obviously in most cases, they took off with a minimal fuel amount to reduce the weight. But there were some missions. There was one mission out of Kadena over in North Korea that took off with a full fuel load, and they did not have a refueling stop on that particular mission, which incidentally brings up an interesting story. Normally above 60,000 feet, the Blackbird ruled the skies. There was nothing else up there. So here this SR-71 is flying over the DMZ in Korea. The pilot looks up and he sees something ahead of him, an object. And as they flash by, they realize it was a weather balloon.
That's funny. Let's see. Okay, so we have one last question. Let's see. Do you know the specifications of the onboard computers, processing speed, amount of RAM, storage, etc.?
I'm sorry, I don't, and I can assure you it's probably very primitive according to today's standards. These computers were, maybe they had transistors in them. They weren't probably analog. They were early digital, but the state of the art in the 1960s was nowhere near what it is today. I personally didn't get a calculator, electronic calculator, until the mid 70s, late 70s actually. So things are progressing on an exponential curve as far as electronic design is concerned, and these were very much in the early days.
Yes. Well, definitely be interesting if the SR-72 gets approved to see what kind of technology comes out of that.
Yeah. Well, what do they call it in those days?
Yeah.
Boeing's also involved in this program in addition to Lockheed Martin. So there are several people that are doing conceptual design at this point.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Okay. So I think that's actually going to do it for today. Alan, thank you so much for joining us.